starting our NFC South roundup series with the second place team from last year, the Atlanta Falcons. That and more on today's episode of Locked On Bucs.
You are Locked On Buccaneers, your daily Tampa Bay Buccaneers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, and welcome into this episode of Locked On Bucs, your daily podcast covering the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I want to thank you for making Locked On Bucs your first listen or view every day. Don't forget you can subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. And of course, you can follow along on Twitter. I am James Yarcho at JYarcho_Bucs, credentialed member of the media covering the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, here with you every Monday through Friday along with the everydayers. And for that, I want to share my appreciation for your continued support of the show. One of the ways you can support the show is become a Locked On Bucs insider. You're going to get news, rumors, updates, general thoughts, one-on-one conversations with me via text message. Go to joinsubtext.com/LockedOnBucs or click the link in the show notes to become an insider today. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. Now, I am starting this series off with the Atlanta Falcons. And what I'm going to do is over the course of the next couple of episodes, I'm going to be joined by the other hosts of the Locked On Network that cover the NFC South to get you all caught up to speed on what's been going on with these teams. It's easy for you to follow along with the Buccaneers. You're here with me. You're following the news with them, but it's also good for you to know what's been going on within the division as we head into the NFL draft. So going in order of how these teams finished, I'm starting this one off with Aaron Freeman, the host of Locked On Falcons. And the big story there is the quarterback situation, which was a big story last year. You remember last year they signed Kirk Cousins to that mega deal. They became the new hotness across the NFL media on TV. They were the favorites to win the division, all those things. But then the draft rolls around and they draft Michael Penix Jr. in the first round, despite giving Kirk Cousins that big contract. They were still the hotness. They were still the favorite. But now it looks as though Kirk Cousins is going to be the highest paid backup in the NFL. So I start there, a team that went up and down, fell apart down the final stretch. That opened the door for the Bucs to win the division, but they're rolling with Michael Penix Jr. Kirk Cousins staying in a backup capacity. And I asked Aaron to talk about what's going on with that situation and what the expectations for Penix are heading into 2025.
Yeah, Michael Penix is the starter. And to answer your first question, there's excitement in the air about, a quarterback named Michael who happens to be black and left-handed. The last time a quarterback with such superficial similarities, it sort of was a cultural tone setter for the city of Atlanta almost 25 years ago. And so I think that's bringing a lot of the excitement. But yeah, he will be the starter this year. And the question is going to be if Kirk Cousins is going to be his backup, because the Falcons are hoping that some team between now and the start of the regular season is going to come calling for them to ask Kirk Cousins to be their starting quarterback and ultimately be able to move him. It doesn't look like that such a trade, if it is going to happen, is going to happen but before this upcoming draft. And the Falcons are kind of looking at a team like Cleveland, given the connections that Kirk Cousins has with the head coach there, who's former offensive coordinator in Minnesota. That team is picking number 2 overall in a draft that most people think has only one really high-level quarterback. And if the Titans take that high-level quarterback and Cam Ward out of Miami at the number 1 overall selection, do the Browns take the number 2 quarterback, who was consensus Shedeur Sanders out of Colorado? That's an open question. But right now, every Falcon fan is hoping that the Browns pass on a quarterback because Kirk Cousins has a no-trade clause. And Kirk Cousins has already been kind of public with the idea of, I'm not going to waive my no-trade clause to go to a team that's only going to wind up doing the thing that the Atlanta Falcons did to me last year in drafting a quarterback with their top 10 selection that I know means that guy is probably going to wind up taking my job at some point if I don't necessarily perform at the level that everybody wants me to perform, as we saw in Atlanta this past year. So everybody's kind of waiting and seeing how the quarterback situation falls out in the top of this draft. And if that opens the door for a Kirk Cousins trade later this offseason, and if the Browns do decide to go for a young quarterback, that may leave the Falcons with a awkward situation in their quarterback room where Kirk Cousins wants to be a starting quarterback in this league, knows that he won't get that opportunity in Atlanta, at least initially. And then it raises the same quarterback controversy situations that the Falcons had last year when they had Kirk Cousins and Michael Penix sort of breathing down his neck. That what happens if Michael Penix struggles in his first full season as an NFL starter? Do the Falcons, with this coaching staff and this front office, feeling the pressure to win? That's why they were hired in Raheem Morris, because Arthur Smith couldn't take this team to the playoffs. If they struggle, do they look at Kirk Cousins and say, hey, Kirk, we gave you $100 million. You were here to bring us to the playoffs. We need you now to come through. So I think everybody wants to avoid that sort of situation. It's in everybody's best interest, Kirk Cousins as well as the Atlanta Falcons, that they can have a amicable divorce at some point this summer. So that's the current situation with the Falcons quarterback situation. And I just so love being able to cover a team that just doesn't know what to do with the quarterbacks. Ever since Matt Ryan's departure, it has just been, this guy, a revolving door, this guy, okay, we're going to go back to this guy. Oh, we're benching Desmond Ridder for Taylor Heineke. Okay, bench Taylor Heineke. Okay, we're benching Kirk, Michael. So I'm enjoying, covering the nonsense that is the Atlanta Falcons at this point in time. So, but all that said, we are legitimately excited about what Michael Penix can be this upcoming season.
Do you personally feel like Penix could have his development kind of stunted if Kirk Cousins is still on the roster in 2025? Because to me, in that situation, I would look at it as Penix is going to play a little bit less free if he's looking over his shoulder, knowing that there is a playoff quarterback waiting in the wings that's making all that money. And if he messes up just one time, that could be his last snap. So, I mean, kind of what, or do you view it more as like, this is Kirk could end up being the ultimate professional and trying to bring this kid along as best he can?
Yeah, I think Kirk has handled it as well as you would expect it. He said all the right things. I guess we're going to find out when this Netflix documentary drops in July, season 2 of Quarterback, where they follow Kirk Cousins around, and maybe we'll see some things that may suggest that Kirk hasn't been necessarily as professional, in that relationship between him and Michael Penix is not as strong as maybe the public seems to think it is. So we are all waiting in bated breath to see how that goes in July. But I think in general, I think the situation with Kirk Cousins is not going to be this drama-fueled situation with Michael Penix. I don't think having Kirk Cousins on the team really helps or really hurts Michael Penix. I feel like all the things that Michael Penix absorbed from Kirk Cousins, the professionalism, the approach to practice, all that stuff that he was able to sort of glean from him, just watching him last summer in training camp and throughout the season in the practice week, is all going to help benefit Michael Penix. Whether Kirk's continued presence in here sort of stunts his development, it's less of an issue for at least Michael Penix, and I think more an issue for folks like myself that talk about the Atlanta Falcons, where it's just going to be this sort of back and forth that if will Penix have the long leash that you need a young quarterback to have to be able to, as you're saying, play free and be able to make mistakes? Is that going to be an issue? I don't think it will be, but I do agree with you in the sense of that possibility does become a situation that the Falcons may have to address if Kirk Cousins is still on this roster come September.
All right, well, let's shift gears a little bit. Free agency, it's in full swing. What are some of the key additions and key losses that the Falcons have faced this offseason? And where are you the most confident that they've made the biggest improvement over what the 2024 Falcons were?
Well, the biggest losses that they've made so far this offseason has been in the trenches. They lost 2 starters to the Chicago Bears, center Drew Dahlman and defensive tackle Grady Jarrett. And Right now, I don't know if the Falcons have really done much to really bolster those two spots. They've so far not really added anything at the center position. They seem to be willing to roll with Ryan Newsel, who filled in for Drew Dahlman last year for 8 games and was serviceable, but whether or not that will be the case for a full season remains to be seen. They did bring in Morgan Fox, the veteran pass rusher from the LA Chargers, to kind of fill the void left from Grady Jarrett. Morgan Fox can bring some of the juice that they're losing in terms of Grady Jarrett as a pass rusher, but Morgan Fox has primarily been a situational player on the interior these last couple of years with the Rams. And so you're not going to get the impact in the run game that Grady Jarrett provided for the Falcons. And he was arguably, their second or third best run defender on that defensive front last season. So the real issue with the Falcons offseason so far in free agency is it doesn't feel like they're significantly better. They've spent a lot of resources investing in backup offensive linemen rather than a starting center. They've spent a lot of resources in bolstering their special teams, adding gunners and adding a kicker and kick returners and other guys that are going to be part of their coverage units on special teams. They have signed some veterans in free agency on the defensive side of the ball. Morgan Fox, as I mentioned, Leonard Floyd, the longtime pass rusher across the league, Georgia native, is sort of a homecoming, but you wonder if Leonard Floyd is in the same boat as Matthew Judon, who they acquired last summer for a 3rd-round pick, being an aging, soon-to-be 33-year-old pass rusher that has probably seen his best days behind him. So you do wonder if the Falcons are basically making the same bet that they were making last summer with Matthew Judon, hoping that he would be that double-digit sack guy that the Falcons haven't had since the 2016 season. You wonder if that's bet's going to work out any better with Leonard Floyd than it did with Matthew Judon. He did not live up to those expectations. They did sort of stabilize their linebacker position, bring in another athletic linebacker in Divine Diablo, but he's an athletic linebacker that was a college safety, doesn't have a ton of experience. It's 4 years playing linebacker in the NFL, but that's very similar to what the Falcons had at that position before. And Troy Anderson, who was a quarterback and running back in college that converted to linebacker, that has struggled to stay healthy. And so the Falcons are making a similar bet there. They brought back Mike Hughes, starting corner. They still have a void at the nickel cornerback spot. They replaced Justin Simmons, their starting safety last year, with Jordan Fuller, who played for Raheem Morris in LA a couple of years, but struggled in Carolina last year, has dealt with injuries and whatnot. So it doesn't feel like the Falcons defense has made significant strides in free agency. And I think that puts a lot of pressure on them to basically be able to get instant impact players on that defensive side of the ball in the draft.
Well, speaking of the draft, that is the direction we are going in next. What are the Falcons going to look to do when they are on the clock? That is coming up next on today's episode of Locked On Bucs, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Ever check your bank account and wonder, where did all my money go? Between dining out, online shopping, entertainment, for me, youth sports are a big one. It's easy to lose track. That's where Monarch Money comes in, your personal CFO, giving you full visibility and control over your finances. Monarch Money isn't just a budgeting app. It's a complete financial command center. You can track all your accounts, all your investments, all of your spending, all in one place. So you stop just managing your money and you start building wealth. Instead of juggling multiple apps, you can use Monarch to check your finances, track your spending, even plan long-term goals. So take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use code LOCKEDONNFL at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. That's monarchmoney.com, code LOCKEDONNFL for half off your first year. All right, Aaron, the NFL draft is about 3 weeks away now, and you just mentioned the Falcons are kind of putting a little pressure on themselves to find those instant impact guys on the defensive side of the ball. Now, what is kind of the overall strategy for the Falcons here? They only have 5 picks. They only have 1 on day 2. They have nothing in the 5th or the 6th rounds. This is one of those drafts where you want a ton of those mid-round picks, and unfortunately the Falcons just don't have them. So, what's kind of the strategy here for the Falcons as they, have pick number 15 in the first round, then they have pick number 46, then they got to wait like 72 picks before they get another one.
Yeah, I think because of that limited number of assets and the relatively high number of needs that they have on the defensive side of the ball, as well as, they could use some depth on the offensive side of the ball as well. Trade back definitely becomes a conversation for the Atlanta Falcons. Whether they pull that off in round one remains to be seen. It takes two to tango. So someone has to want to come up in order for you to move back. Do they do that in round two and try to maybe get a fourth round pick by moving back a couple of spots in round two? Those are going to be the big questions. This team under general manager Terry Fontenot has traditionally not been a trade back team. They've been more aggressive in trading up, particularly on day two. They've done that in the second round in each of the last 3 years, giving up third and fourth round picks in order to do that. And those picks would certainly feel a little bit more useful now to help bolster this defense. But yeah, I think right now you're looking at a trade back option, but whether the Falcons stick and pick, whether they move back and accumulate more assets, this draft is going to be very defensive focused. The Falcons went to the combine and only interviewed the 45 formal interviews that they're allowed at the combine. They were only interviewing defensive players. And that kind of tells you with some of the ways that they've addressed this offseason, focusing on bringing back backup offensive linemen that didn't even make the active roster last year, kind of tells you that the Falcons are going to completely punt on the offensive side of the ball in the draft. Maybe they add a center, maybe they add a tight end, maybe in the late rounds or something like that. But it's going to be very defensive focused. And particularly in round one, I've been saying all offseason long on Locked On Falcons, they have to go with an edge rusher in that first round pick. The Falcons have had the worst pass rush in the NFL for 2 decades. They were coming off a season where they had 31 sacks. They were 31st in the NFL. And basically like 2/3 of those sacks came in a 5-game stretch after their bye week last year, and they can't really rely on, hey, we're going to be able to do that again next year and be able to get to a respectable number of sacks. They were on pace at some point to get like 13 sacks over the course of the season, like a historically terrible, sack total. And because of that, there was so much pressure on this team that people were screaming last year when they took Michael Penix, take a pass rusher. The previous year, when they took Bijan Robinson, take a pass rusher. The previous year at that, when they took Drake London, take a pass rusher. This team has neglected that and not been willing to invest their highest draft capital into that position, and they have to do it this year. This team basically becomes an unserious franchise. They have zero credibility if they ignore the pass rush in round one once again. But it's not just their pass rush that needs help. They need, some run stuffers at the D tackle position. They could use a starting caliber cornerback, whether that's an outside or inside guy. They could use another safety. They could use some linebacker depth. They have a ton of needs, not in addition to, they could upgrade the center position due to the loss of Drew Dalman. So there's a lot of needs on this football team, not a lot of draft picks to utilize it, but this is going to be a defensive focused draft. And hopefully the Falcons will be able to get some immediate impact players. That has not been something that they've had a lot of success with under the Terry Fontenot regime. Last year's, they used their day 2 picks, second, third, and fourth round picks on defensive linemen. Those 3 guys combined for 0 sacks and 6 pressures last year. Not the type of improvement, not the type of impact that you want from your rookie class. And so the Falcons are going to have to basically do a complete 180 and get, some guys that, may be in the conversation for defensive rookie of the year, something like that, to really bolster this defense and get those immediate impact players.
All right, so Bucs fans, you just heard Aaron Freeman say that the Falcons are taking Jared Wilson, the center from Georgia, at pick 15, PFF's 83rd ranked prospect. Now, obviously, I'm kidding, but if anyone was going to do something crazy like that, it's the Atlanta Falcons. Now, I've been talking a lot of edge rushers on Locked On Bucs because even with the signing of Hassan Reddick, I don't feel that they're done at that position. That's still a position I am looking at in the first round. But who are some guys that you are personally eyeing for Atlanta there at pick 15 in the first round? And then maybe a name or two that you're really keeping your fingers crossed falls to them in the second round, because that second round pick is going to be that much more important, not having a third in this draft.
Yeah, I'm looking at, a lot of the focus right now for the Falcons at pick 15 in terms of the edge rush room is the 2 Georgia guys in Mykel Williams and Jalen Walker. Now, me personally, I'm not as high on the Georgia guys, but it has been a long bugaboo amongst the Falcon fans that also share an allegiance to the Georgia Bulldogs football program that this team does not tend to use premium draft picks on Georgia players. They have used a bunch of 6th and 7th round picks on Georgia players, but not gotten any of the sort of big swings in those difference makers that have, created so many headlines in recent months and recent years, like Jalen Carter, Nolan Smith, and, basically the half of the Philadelphia Eagles defense at this point in time. And so those are two guys that I think a lot of people are sort of expecting, but I'm not as high on those guys. I'm looking at guys like Mike Green out of Marshall, Shamar Stewart out of Texas A&M, Donovan Ezeraku, potentially out of Boston College. I think those guys can bring a little bit more juice in terms of immediate impact on this defense than the Georgia guys, and also may have more upside to be not only high floor guys, but also be the long-term answers that this Falcons team is so desperate to find at pass rush. The Falcons have not successfully developed a pass rusher in 25 years since Patrick Kearney, right? Vic Beasley had that one monster year where he led the NFL in sacks with 15.5 sacks in 2016, and then basically fell off a cliff after that point. So the Falcons desperately need to end that curse of a quarter century of not being able to hit on early round pass rushers. But I think those three guys, Green, Stewart, and Ezeraku, are sort of the guys that I'm geared at in round one. And then in round two, I feel like cornerback makes a ton of sense, but currently I'm kind of looking at some of the D tackles. I know this is a deep D tackle class, so that may be a position that they can maybe wait and maybe pull the trigger on in round 4, because there may be still some good guys there. But I think, some of these run pluggers, guys like Tyleik Williams out of Ohio State, Alfred Collins out of Texas, guys that can come in and really beef up this run defense, are some of those guys that I'm really eyeing at this point in round 2.
Lots of similar prospects being talked about on Locked On Falcons and Locked On Bucs. But Aaron, I'm just going to throw this out there. I like you just fine. I think we get along great. But if the Falcons draft Benjamin Morrison, you and I are going to have a fist fight. We'll do it for charity, but we're going to throw down because that's my dude. And if he ends up in Atlanta, I'm going to be furious. If he ends up in Carolina or New Orleans, I'll be furious too. I'll challenge those guys to a charity fist fight as well. Yeah, lots of competition here between the Falcons and the Bucs for some positions that they are looking for. But Aaron, we're going to find out where you think the Falcons stack up against the NFC South as things stand right now. That is coming up next on today's episode of Locked On Bucs. Madness is here, and FanDuel is giving you the chance to get in on the action like never before. Right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. That's $200 extra bucks to use on everything from buzzer beaters to Cinderella stories, even who's cutting down the nets. The Final Four is set, and although there aren't any Cinderella stories in this year's Final Four, without a doubt, it is going to be the 4 best teams in college basketball going head-to-head for a chance to win the national championship. Duke is still the favorite at plus 110, followed by the Florida Gators at plus 270, and then Houston and Auburn are tied, both sitting at plus 450. The FanDuel app is super easy to use, and when I win, I get paid instantly. No waiting around for those winnings to show up in my account. So visit FanDuel.com and get in on the college hoops action all tournament long. Wrapping things up here on an NFC South Atlanta Falcons focus episode of Locked On Bucs. And the Falcons looked to be on track last year to dethrone the Bucs in the division last year, and then everything fell apart, as somebody said that they would. But you look at the teams in the South now. Where do you think the Falcons rank among this division? And do you feel that they're strong enough to overtake Tampa atop the division the way that they are currently constructed?
As they are sitting here currently, no. It is Tampa Bay's division to lose. As we have done this dance so many times, James, over the last couple of years of who is going to challenge the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And every season I sit here and I raise my hand, it's going to be the Atlanta Falcons. And hey, in week 7, week 8, week 9, when they're in first place, it looks great. And then, somehow the Falcons manage to not finish strong. It's weird how that keeps happening to this football team. And so whether that's really the big question, it feels like it's like just like clockwork, or week 7, week 8, hey, Falcons are going to be looking great at the top of the NFC South, but whether or not they're going to be able to finish strong, a lot of that is going to depend on the development of Michael Penix as he gets more and more reps. That's really what is going to determine if this team is really going to be able to overtake the Bucs this year. If Michael Penix is a guy, if he looks like, Jaden Daniels 2.0, but it's just slightly delayed in that regard, and that if we could, time travel back to see who's going to be the offensive rookie of the year, if we could take Michael Penix first year as a starter in 2025 and put it up against Jaden Daniels first year as a starter in 2024, if there's a legit conversation to be had on who was the better rookie starter, then I think the Falcons will definitely be in a position to win this division by year's end. But if we're not having that conversation, there's nothing right now with the Atlanta Falcons, particularly on the defensive side of the ball, that makes you think they're going to be able to really stop anybody, which has been the trend these past couple of years, and a big reason why they haven't been able to finish strong, because they can't stop teams from scoring points. And so really at this point in time, it's really about Michael Penix and all the weapons that they have on this offense at this point, winning every game 38-35, because that's what it looks like it's going to have to be if this team is going to have a winning record this year.
Yeah, it sounds kind of like what they're going through in Cincinnati. It's like, sure, Joe Burrow can have all those weapons, but he's going to have to score 40 a game because the defense will give up 42. Taking a look at the NFC South, and it's been an interesting division, honestly, since its inception, because it seems like you can never really guess what's going to happen. Something crazy is going to derail things in the division each and every year. But when you take a look at the way these teams are right now, who do you think is going to surprise a lot of people? And that surprise could be good or it could be bad. But which one of those teams do you look at and go, you know what? Watch out for them in 2025, because it's either going to be like blowing everyone's mind, or we're all going to point and laugh in unison together.
Well, it pains me to say this, but the New Orleans Saints are probably the most interesting team because of new head coach Kellen Moore. And right, it feels like with Derek Carr, the Saints are pretty much locked in to win 8 or 9 games every single season. And they didn't have a healthy Carr last year, and that's a big reason why they didn't meet that total. But probably if he had played the entire season, they probably would have won 8 or 9 games last year. And so to me, the interesting conversation is whether or not Kellen Moore can kind of change the math on what the Saints have been these last 3-4 years, where they're pretty much a consistent team that's going to finish either slightly below 500 or slightly above 500. And if that's the case, that he can sort of raise the ceiling for that football team and that offense, particularly, and get Derek Carr playing at a higher level than what we've seen these last couple of years in New Orleans and in Las Vegas, then that could be the thing that could really give the Bucs the biggest challenge. But I'm hoping, as I intimated earlier, that Michael Penix has that sort of dominant first year as a starter, and we're sitting here looking at this 2024 draft class as a historic one with Jaden Daniels and Drake May and Caleb Williams, Michael Penix and Bo Nix and all those guys, JJ McCarthy, living up to the hype that we thought the 21 draft class with Trevor Lawrence and Justin Fields and all those guys was going to deliver on, and maybe this upcoming draft class is. And so that to me is the one surprise that I would sit there and say, hey, maybe Michael Penix is actually, one of the best young quarterbacks in the NFL, and that certainly will probably catch a lot of people outside of Atlanta by surprise. And that's probably the one thing I'm looking forward to. I am certainly not looking forward to the Saints possibly being good again.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because the team that I have looked at, and it's one that we haven't talked about at all on this show, I'm looking at the Panthers and I'm thinking, okay, Dave Canales had Bryce Young playing really well down the stretch, and all of a sudden they were getting really hot, and they're starting to make some improvements. And now they have, Rico Dowdle added to that running back room, and they're starting to put something together. To me, the Panthers are kind of a scary team heading into 2025.
Well, I think the Panthers formula is basically the same as the Falcons formula, which is great offense, terrible defense. And I think the difference between the Panthers and the Falcons is because of what you're talking about with Bryce Young playing so well down the stretch, you have a little bit more proof of concept with what they can potentially be if they can continue to pick up where they left off at the end of the season, and particularly if with that top 10 pick, maybe they could get, the second best wide receiver if you count Travis Hunter as the best wide receiver in this draft class. And what does that do for that offense? And so I do think the Panthers are going to definitely make things a lot more interesting in this NFC South division. But ultimately, I think just like the Falcons, if they're going to really make a push, it's going to require them to beat teams 44-38, which they did in week 18 when they faced the Atlanta Falcons.
All right. Well, for everything Atlanta Falcons, of course, all of you guys go check out Aaron on Locked On Falcons. Support him. He does a great job over there. Aaron, thank you so much for getting Bucs fans caught up as to what's going on with the Atlanta Falcons. I really appreciate it.
Always appreciate talking with you, James.
All right. That is going to do it for this episode. Please make sure that you are following along with everything on Twitter at Locked On Bucs, at @JYarcho_Bucs. Make sure that you are subscribed on YouTube with those notifications turned on, as well as wherever you get your podcasts. And if you want to help support the show, become a Locked On Bucs insider. Go to joinsubtext.com/LockedOnBucs or click the link in the show notes. If you don't want to become an insider, but you do want to support the show, take a moment, please. Leave a 5-star review wherever you listen to the show. Leave a little bit of a review. It does help other Buccaneers fans find this show. Hope you all have an absolutely outstanding day. Stay safe, stay healthy, fire the cannons. I want to thank you so much for joining me right here on Locked On Bucs, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.